Ever since the release of Tears of the Kingdom, players have been up in arms about the new lore revelations that the game dropped. Was Nintendo trying to completely erase the past 40-some years of video games in preference for a rebooted timeline? Or were the Wild Era games proving to be non-canon for the rest of the Zelda timeline? Or did Nintendo just not care at all? Well, I had those same questions for the longest time, but then I got to work on a brand new timeline theory for The Legend of Zelda. In my months of work rearranging everything we knew about these games, I managed to find an answer so clear that I would consider this the canon series of events. So much simpler than any idea that King Rauru lied about founding Hyrule, or that there was a huge refounding set after every other game in the entire timeline, that I'm almost surprised that I seem to be the first one to put the pieces together. So here's how you've been viewing Hyrule's ancient history all wrong. The earliest point in the Zelda series was most recently retold by Echoes of Wisdom. Before any life could spring out from the universe, there existed a being known as Null, who lived to consume anything that threatened the vast nothingness it inhabited. The ethereal golden goddesses then decided to devise a plan to trap Null inside of a planet of their own creation to stop its endless cycle of annihilating all life. So began the creation of Hyrule, when Din, the goddess of power, created the land that surrounded Null. Farore, goddess of courage, then created all life that would inhabit this land. And finally Nehru, the goddess of wisdom, laid law and order for all life to follow as they exist in Hyrule. And the golden goddesses were clairvoyant to the potential that Null might attempt to escape, so they spread the beams known as Tries across Hyrule to guard the surface and repair any rifts that Null might create. Next, the goddesses left behind a mark of the Earth's divine making, the Triforce, that had the power to gift its bearer with one almighty wish. But if that bearer was unbalanced in the goddess's virtues of power, courage, and wisdom, they would be corrupted by the godly power of the Triforce. And finally, they gave the goddess Hylia the role of protector for all Hyrule's life, to watch over the land and maintain law and order before the golden goddesses retreated from Hyrule. And so the land was left to its own devices, with races like the Hylians, Gerudos, Zora, Goron, and Rito developing into prehistoric civilizations during the era of Hylia. Now, the most prominent people during this time were actually the Zonai, a people who showed an uncanny understanding of Hyrule's divinity, and the depth of their technological prowess at the time proved as such. The Zonai became a prevalent people to the goddess Hylia, who would bestow upon them 7 secret stones, which could amplify the elemental power of its wearer. Immediately, you'll probably have your problems with my use of Tears of the Kingdom, taking any of its lore and putting it before the events of Skyward Sword. And I'm not about to say that these events of a prehistoric Hyrule is the time period which Princess Zelda is sent to in the events of Tears of the Kingdom, but a recent addition to this game's lore has given us a lot to glean from the Golden Age for the mysterious Zonai that might just prove me right. On June 5th last year, Nintendo released their successor to the Nintendo Switch, alongside a pack of upgrades to their earlier titles to play smoother and clearer on the Switch 2. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom were part of these upgrades, and Nintendo even released the Zelda Notes app, which added a handful of new voice lines from Princess Zelda, King Rauru, and Master Koga to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom respectively. Though the history that Tears of the Kingdom told might have been hard to dissect at the time, I think that we can pick apart these voice lines to prove the true placements of the founding of Hyrule Kingdom, and what we're focusing on for now, a prehistoric age of the Zonai before their flight above the clouds. In more than one of King Rauru's voice lines, he makes himself clear that there are records of his own civilization's culture that he never experienced.
This is known as a Zonai device dispenser. But the concept of leaving things to chance is not one often seen in our civilization. I myself believe that it was originally created with a different purpose. Maybe it was used for entertainment, or maybe it was not even originally made by the Zonai. The ways of our ancestors are sometimes unclear, but they are also interesting puzzles to unravel. The Temple of Time is a bell tower and faithful timekeeper, as well as a spiritual center of this land. It was constructed in a traditional Zonai architectural style that extends both up into the sky and down into the ground. It was believed in ancient times that such a design could pierce through evil.
King Rauru speaks about these notable parts of the Zonai's identifiable design during Tears of the Kingdom's gameplay, as if their history were entirely lost to his people by his coming of age. And furthermore, both Rauru and Minoru would actively engage in experimentation and anthropological research to understand their people's past.
Our culinary constructs were imparted with knowledge of both cooking meals and concocting medicines. Though they have no taste buds, they learn to mimic the movements we make when tasting food. Even my sister, who gifted them with the ability to learn in the first place, was surprised by what they gleaned through simple observation. I get a strong sense of nostalgia in this place. When I was young, I was intensely interested in finding and studying treasure maps. Before I knew it, I had become quite familiar with the topography of the Sky Islands and, incidentally, with Zonai devices. Nothing motivates one to learn like a healthy sense of curiosity.
So clearly, Rauru and Minoru were missing plenty of knowledge of the older Zonai society, but this doesn't necessarily prove that the Zonai are involved with the goddess Hylia or the events of the Zelda timeline before Skyward Sword on its own. Yeah, the Zelda Notes voice lines might make it clear to us that there's a deeper history to the Zonai that Rauru and Minoru, through all their research and experience of their own people, are unaware of, but I'm making a bigger claim than just that. I want to prove that the Zonai existed before Skyward Sword, and that King Rauru did, in fact, found Hyrule Kingdom. But how can we be sure that the Zonai existed in this era of time specifically? If we go to the Lanayru region of Breath of the Wild for a moment, the Zora stone monuments detail their people's history and the founding of Zora's domain, specifically stated by these documents. As the legends go, the domain was born 10,000 years ago, just in time for the ancient hero to vanquish Calamity Ganon, and King Rauru references history between the Zora and the Zonai in the Zelda Notes app when describing Wellspring Island.
The water that flows from here eventually becomes clouds and rain, bringing water down to the land. The Zora people in ancient times had dealings with the Zonai, and I can imagine they used the immense waterfall to travel from the surface to the sky. It is appropriate some refer to this waterfall as a bridge.
So, the Zonai could have only been around sometime after the founding of Zora's domain, right? Well, the clear issue now is that Ancient Hero's aspect clothing item in Tears of the Kingdom, which depicts a seriously alien-looking character, even for Zelda standards. Most people already agree that this Ancient Hero must have existed after the Age of the Zonai, since there's no appearance of any such hero around Hyrule's founding other than the weird Zonai construct in Age of Imprisonment, and the Sheikah's technology, which is widely understood to be the Sheikah's own version of mimicking the godly and mysterious technology left behind by the Zonai, plays a massive hand in the ancient Calamity's defeat. So there must be a society of Zora that had existed before the founding of their domain in the Lanayru region. And there's one more piece of information that I think clears up the mystery of the Zonai perfectly. In Skyward Sword, when Link's journey takes him to the home of the Zora, the Lanayru region, what he sees is nothing but a massive desert. A desert inhabited by ancient robots in a region where, generations prior, there was Zora architecture in place to transport cargo and rain down water via the Wellspring Island, which has completely disappeared by the time of Skyward Sword. And now I think is a good time to remind you of just how Link finds these ancient temples in Tears of the Kingdom. The Temple of Time, along with the Zora's Architectural Islands, the Zora's Wellspring Island, and the Rito's Stormwind Arc, all descend from above the clouds. The Gerudo's Lightning Temple rises from beneath the sand, and the Goron's lost city of Gorondia remains abandoned beneath the volcanic regions of Death Mountain inside the depths. All of Hyrule's major species seem to have fled from some event by either raising themselves into the skies or sinking into the depths of the earth. All except for the Hylians, who don't have any specialized temples that reappear from prehistoric times in Tears of the Kingdom, because their oldest recorded society comes from the founding of Hyrule Kingdom after the events of Skyward Sword. It seems pretty clear to me now that all the surface's societies must have fled from the very events that precede Skyward Sword's story, when the bringer of demise breaks through to the surface of Hyrule. The Zonai, Rito, Goron, Gerudo, and Zora people all fled either above or below the surface to escape the war. To start with, Zelda Notes also tells us that Gorondia did have relations with the Zonai too.
These rails are intended to transport materials, but they also supply energy through pipes. The Goron people make extensive use of this kind of mechanism, and I believe it is possible they modeled their designs on our own technology.
But if the evidence so far seems to point towards a prehistoric Zonai people existing before the events of Skyward Sword, then Grandia likely wasn't a response to the war brought on by the bringer of demise, but simply that the Gorons used to be an entirely subterranean society. But how then might the Gorons have been affected by the surface war before Skyward Sword in the same way that all Hyrule's other species had been? Well, we know a couple things about the Gorons in Skyward Sword. One, that there are shockingly few, only 3 Gorons in the entire game. 2, that Death Mountain, the surface location which Gorondia had been built beneath, was currently active. And 3, that the Gorons were one of the few surface people that stayed behind with the goddess Hylia to fight against the bringer of demise and his army of demons. In Tears of the Kingdom, the only reason that Gorondia is able to be accessed is because the Elden region was no longer volcanically active, opening up Death Mountain to the Lost City for the first time in tens of thousands of years. In that same game's cutscene, Death Mountain is also volcanically active in the distance, so Gorondia was seemingly abandoned since before the events of Skyward Sword. And for the Zonai, I think that despite the artistic discrepancy, I do believe the Zonai's constructs are the same ancient robots we see in Skyward Sword, labeled by their connection to Lanayru Deserts, a region we already know has lots of Zora, but a direct bridge to the Zonai with extensive transportation of cargo between the skies and the surface. Now, I think this is already plenty of evidence that not just the Zonai, but all the major races' ancient architecture that appeared by the time of Tears of the Kingdom were built before the time of Skyward Sword. But the species that probably has the closest relationship to the Zonai before their disappearance might convince you fully. Let's go back to the Zelda Notes app where Kinraru describes the Rito people's Stormwind arc.
Ah, I think I remember. When a Zonai tumbled, Rito wings gave chase. In thanks for their salvation, the Stormwind arc was made. A gift given from the Zonai, and the Rito filled with joy. It is an old legend of my people. Could this be that vessel?
And similarly, the Son of the Stormwind Arc tells of the Zonais, whom the Rito refer to with divine vernacular like the Hylians, escape. With the world in upheaval, we pledge to help the Lord. A line of ships soaring, built as a passage skyward, the god ascended to heaven, leaving behind an arc. It's almost too perfect a story that the Zonai and the Rito tell of, where the Zonai are deliberately leaving above the clouds with the help of the Rito's airships, who are gifted the Stormwind Arc in return, which the Rito then use to flee the skies alongside the Zonai. We went through a lot in pretty rapid succession, so let's recap what I've been getting at over the course of this video. Before the founding of Hyrule Kingdom as seen in Tears of the Kingdom, even before the arrival of the Hylians from their sky islands as seen in Skyward Sword, an even older, prehistoric age of Hyrule, sometimes referred to as the Godly Era or the Era of the Goddess Hylia, saw the earliest civilizations of the 6 most influential species in the Zelda series: the Hylians, Rito, Zora, Gerudo, Gorons, and the Zonai. Due to the prehistoric Zonai's excellence in channeling the world's magical qualities, the goddess Hylia would bestow 6 secret stones to the tribe. While all these civilizations would continue their own developments, they would need aid from the Zonai to birth their cultural characteristics, like the Rito's flying ships and the Gorons' mining colonies. This era of Hylia would come to an end at the arrival of the bringer of demise. Alongside a massive army, Demise breached the surface world and sent the world into disarray. Despite the Zonai having been chosen directly by Hylia to harness divine power for the world's protection, they would use their technological power to raise their most important architecture above the clouds and go into hiding. Hylia stayed on the surface with an army of all the remaining surface-dwelling races to fight the war that the Demon King raged onto the earth. With these people, Hylia fought a war of unmatched scale, the likes of which would never be seen again. The lands were burned and the spring soiled as the Demon King's forces murdered without hesitation. During this war, the Zora's main source of water, their wellspring island, would be lost, transforming the region into a desert for a time. The Zonai constructs that had been given to the Zora would be left behind and even more forgotten inside the depths of the earth to continue their functions without end. The Gorons would lose their city of Gorondia, and the Rito would be escorts for the Zonai to leave the surface before using their airships to escape as well. The Gerudo sink their lightning temple beneath the sands of the deserts, and the Hylians were sent into the sky just like the Zonai, Rito, and Zora. After all is said and done, the goddess Hylia enacted her plan to abandon her godlyhood, and be reincarnated as the Hylian Zelda, leaving behind her sword with the Hylians, her new chosen people, to finally vanquish the bringer of demise when the time was right. This video came about while I was building a very long timeline theory that aimed to fix the issues with Nintendo's official statements: inconsistent time travel, an irrelevant what-if branch of the timeline, and a large disconnected story, just to name a few issues. While my larger timeline pretty quickly goes off the rails from what could ever be considered true in Nintendo's official timeline, I thought the points made here were good enough to turn it into its own video, and it helped me break the huge theory into bite-sized pieces. Thank you again for watching this video if you've made it this far, and trust me, you do not want to miss where my timeline goes next.